Buenas noches y bienvenidos a todos a Casa Árabe.
Welcome to Casa Árabe. Welcome to this conference, which will be addressing counterterrorism against jihadist terrorism in France and Great Britain. We have with us Frank Foley, who is a professor of international relations at King's College in London. He's a professor of international relations at the War Department at King's College in London, and his research focuses on counterterrorism, human rights, intelligence, and police agencies, especially in France, Great Britain, and the United States. And he's written the book Countering Terrorism in Britain and France. This book we have here, which looks at institutions and rules in these three different countries, and which compares the situation in all three countries. Frank has a PhD in political science. He's worked at Stanford, and he currently is a researcher at the Center of Constitutional Studies. He's also provided information to governments and professionals in the area of security in France, Great Britain, and the United States, and he often works on terrorism and counterterrorism with the media, such as the BBC, France 24, or Voice of America. Welcome, Frank. Welcome to Casa Árabe. I would like to thank your presence here. Jihadism has grown in Europe, and this is something of concern to all of us. Over the last few weeks, Casa Árabe has received many calls from the media looking for an explanation from experts about what is happening not only in the Middle East but also in Europe. We've gotten more and more calls, and it doesn't seem that we'll be getting fewer calls anytime soon. Jihadism has socio-economic roots. We could talk at length about the situation in societies where there's inequality, segregation, marginalization, and the economic crisis has compounded the situation. There are also, however, ideological roots, such as the influence of Wahhabism from the Arabian Peninsula. We've seen more sectarianism fueled in that region by the most radical groups, and we've also seen new groups such as Al-Qaeda and more recently Daesh. International geopolitics compounds the situation. The adventure of the United States in Iraq, which has become a real nightmare for what was called the nascent democracy in the old Mesopotamia. The outcome has been catastrophic, but there are also issues such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as double standards that have been applied, and of course also colonialism, which the region suffered from. 9/11 is proof of the effects of geopolitics, and the terrorist attacks in London and Madrid are also proof of that. Analysts agree that the situation changed in 2013 when Europeans realized that many of their citizens were going to Iraq and Syria, British, French, Dutch, Belgian citizens, and some Spanish citizens. Spain isn't among the country sending more new recruits to those countries. Before giving the floor to Frank, I would like to refer to a document I've been reading written by the intelligence services of the Netherlands. It's called The Transformation of Jihadism in the Netherlands, and it's available on the internet. It talks about something very interesting, which they call swan dynamics, and they reach the conclusion that jihadists have changed their behavior significantly since 2013. Some people might say this goes back to some earlier years, but actually this change has been more marked since Daesh arrived on the scene. And there are 5 elements in this document. The different transnational network cells are being increasingly replaced by individuals. They're not real sub-networks, even though European jihadists often said they wanted to combat in a foreign conflict area, whether it be Afghanistan, Iraq, or Pakistan, but actually very few went there. This has changed with Iraq, Syria, and Daesh. There weren't massive exodus towards conflict zones from Europe, but 2013 was a changing point. These groups improved their modus operandi. They managed to avoid the police. They also invoked the freedom of speech and the rule of law in Europe to avoid being arrested. They are also more provocative ideologically. Because of freedom of speech, it is easy for them to disseminate their distorted vision of Islam. They proselytize more and more. They have more and more confidence in themselves, and they're now revealing their identity. They used to work undercover, and now they no longer hide their identity. They are using the social media for their propaganda. There used to be a vertical structure in the past. There was a clear line of command in the past. Now we see a more horizontal structure. There used to be someone issuing messages and people receiving them, and now there are many people issuing messages through YouTube, Facebook, through streaming, with comments and the reactions that all of these comments give rise to. And this leads us to this beehive behavior. This is a picture, it's a small picture, but here you see a beehive. And the idea is that it's very decentralized, it's very flexible, and there are different individuals without any central hierarchy, but with a common ideology and objectives. The word is caliphate. That's the objective. That's where they want to get to, and they can mobilize a large number of individuals. This also explains the extreme behavior of some of these individuals. Let me now move on to what this document says about a plan which highlights 6 items. First, risk needs to be reduced. Passports revoked, foreign fighters European foreign fighters that go to conflict areas must be put in international lists. Interpol has to be involved. Individuals need to be traced if they fly through international airports, because some of these individuals drive to Turkey. And material to manufacture explosives needs to be banned, and so on. After that, they should be prevented from going to the Middle East, from traveling there. In the third place, we have to prevent radicalization. So we have to work with Muslim communities to the greatest possible extent in Europe. We have to educate in schools, and we have to get into prisons in order to stop those toxic messages from spreading. We have to be increasingly active in the social media to also deactivate those toxic fora. Cooperation between government institutions needs to be enhanced, and that's something which leads us into Frank Foley's presentation. We need to see how the different law enforcement agencies should enhance their cooperation so that they can stem this phenomenon. And lastly, this would be the leitmotif, we need a counter-narrative, a different narrative of the one Daesh is presenting, which is attractive, very sophisticated, and that's one of the reasons why many young Europeans, because in the Netherlands we're talking not about second-generation young people, but third, fourth, and fifth generation young people, so very, very Dutch young people, and this is very alarming. We need to understand what would attract these Europeans, and we need to understand that in order to define a strategy. And that's the challenge. I saw this in YouTube. The person who posted that there wasn't too optimistic. There's certainly a lot to do. And let me now give the floor to Frank Foley.
Gracias. Gracias, Karim. Bueno, estoy muy contento de estar aquí hoy en la Casa Árabe y hablar sobre mis
Happy to be here and share my research work with you. I'd like to thank Karim and Olivia and the director of Casa Árabe, Eduardo López Busquets, for their invitation. I'm going to speak English because it's easier for me, and it's probably better for you, I assume.
So this evening I'm going to talk mainly about my research on the fight against terrorism in Britain and France, but I will also make some very brief comments about whether and how these two cases can help us think about the fight against terrorism in Spain. Karim talked about jihadism. Why do we use this term? Well, we use this term in some ways because it's a social phenomenon that we need to give a label to. We used to talk about Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaedaism, but this was never sufficient because there was always groups and individuals inspired by these kinds of ideas that went beyond Al-Qaeda. And so we needed something to label this social phenomenon, to understand its characteristics. In my book, I used the term Islamist terrorism, which I think is okay for an academic publication like mine. That was my understanding at the time. But I since came to the view that using the word Islamist terrorism quickly gets confused with something called Islamic terrorism, which other people refer to. And I came to the view that this term was very counterproductive and it was unfair. and it was misleading, certainly to use in public discourses. To associate Islam with terrorism in this way was completely misleading. But still, we needed something to capture that this is a particular ideology which draws on different sources, but has a coherence and is a recognizable social phenomenon. And so, in some ways, the best we can come up with is jihadist terrorism. One could also talk about takfiri terrorism, but jihadist terrorism is the more popular term that for me is the preferable term. It's not ideal because it isolates one part of jihad, which is a struggle with many different aspects. It puts to one side the personal aspect or the spiritual aspect of the struggle. But for the purposes of analysis, we use the term used by the so-called jihadists themselves, which when they talk about jihad as a fight in the military sense. And this is why I use the term jihadist terrorism. I'm going to talk about state responses to terrorism, and in fact I'm not going to talk that much about the evolution of the terrorist threat, because my argument is that to understand counterterrorism, we need to understand less the type of terrorism in question. What we really need to understand is the type of state that we're living in, the society that we live in, its institutions, its history. That's what we really need to understand to understand counterterrorism, more than going into a detailed analysis of the terrorist threat. I'm going to make this argument in relation to Britain and France. And how I make that argument is to say that Britain and France have faced a similar threat from jihadist terrorism in recent decades, and they've often perceived that threat in a similar way. However, despite these similarities, Britain and France have often responded to that threat in different ways, and notably in three ways. They have different approaches to anti-terrorism legislation. So I argue that the French take a more draconian approach here than the British. French laws are more draconian than British laws when it comes to terrorism. That's the first aspect of my argument. The second aspect is that when it comes to police operations against suspected terrorists, the French also take a tougher approach here. And thirdly, when it comes to the long-term effort to improve social cohesion in society, there are also different approaches taken in Britain and France in terms of how the government and the police interact with Muslim communities. So if you think about these differences, the question is, why is that the case? Why have they responded differently to a similar threat or to a similar phenomenon? And that's the main question I address in my book. I highlight 3 or 4 main factors, but tonight I'm just going to focus on one strand of my argument, which is that the different historical experiences of Britain and France have led them to have a different set of ideas and beliefs about security and liberty. And it's these different ideas and beliefs that explain a lot about their different approaches to counterterrorism. So that'll be the structure of my talk. Now, the first step in this argument is the historical background, or to be more precise, how the British and French interpret their history. Now, if you think about Britain, a couple of things emerge. In Britain, one finds that the idea of traditional British civil liberties is important in public debate. So British civil liberties. One also finds that the idea, there is a prominent idea that Britain has long been an island of political stability. So stability as a second central idea, and there's a certain idea of British resilience based around stories and ideas about how the country defended itself during the Second World War. So British liberties, stability, and resilience. These are 3 ideas that resonate a lot in the British context. If you think about France, by contrast, France has a more universal and maybe a more abstract concept or conception of liberty. Secondly, from the French Revolution up to about 1958 at least, France was a place of considerable political instability, again in contrast to the British self-conception. And also, unlike Britain, France's borders were breached by German armies twice in the 20th century, which, along with other experiences, has contributed to a heightened awareness of the potential vulnerability of France to certain kinds of threats, or to various kinds of threats. So a universal, and I would argue a bit more abstract and less concrete conception of liberty, an idea of French potential instability of the Republic and its potential vulnerability. Now, other historical experiences are also relevant, like France's memory of fighting insurgency in Algeria. That differs from how Britain remembers its experience of fighting terrorism in Northern Ireland. Britain says that it learned from Northern Ireland not to take a disproportionate or an excessive response to terrorism. The French don't necessarily take that lesson from Algeria. And my argument is that these different histories and these different interpretations of history have led Britain and France, or British and French societies, to have a different configuration of ideas concerning security, liberty, and related concepts. So you have sets of ideas in the two countries, but the configurations are quite different. Now, one thing they have in common is that the idea of security is very important in both countries. This idea that you must maximize security. It's a very powerful idea. But the difference is that in France, other key ideas tend to reinforce the idea of security. So, for example, if France is seen as a potentially vulnerable state, then the response to that in public discourse is to say that we French must take very strong action against potential threats. So in other words, the idea of vulnerability reinforces the power of the security logic. So security is reinforced by other key ideas in the French case. In the British case, the idea of security is challenged by many other ideas. So the logic in British public discourse has often gone something like this. Often one hears in public discourse people saying things like, we, the British, are resilient people, we've survived threats in the past, we survived Hitler, we don't have to give up our civil liberties just because of terrorism. That's an idea that one hears. Senior judges have made this point when they were ruling on government anti-terrorism laws, when they were throwing out government anti-terrorism laws. Senior judges made this point. We are resilient people. We don't need to give up our civil liberties in response to terrorism. Members of Parliament made this point in 2005 when they voted down a very draconian proposal by Tony Blair to change the law in Britain concerning counter-terrorism. But that proposal about pre-charge detention, the amount of time you could hold someone in a jail before you charge them with a crime, that was voted down in Parliament. And so, some of the logic behind that, or some of the people voting against that, were saying things like, we are resilient people, we don't need to change our values and our laws just because of terrorism. So the idea of resilience actually challenges the idea of security. Obviously the idea of traditional British civil liberties, Magna Carta, that kind of stuff, also challenges this focus on security as an overwhelming priority. So if we come back to France, if security, the idea of security, is reinforced by other ideas, what that leads to, I argue, is that there's effectively a consensus in French society around the preeminence of security. The most important actors in politics, the media, the judiciary, and in other parts of society, they largely agree that the security of the Republic is more important than any other consideration. So when I went and did interviews in France for my book, government officials, told me again and again there is this consensus in French society against terrorism, to be strong against terrorism. I also spoke to representatives of human rights organizations, non-governmental organizations, and they told me that it's often difficult for them to make their voices heard in public discussions of counterterrorism in France. They try to intervene in debate about the issue of security and liberty, but they don't really make an impact on legislation at the end of the day. So a consensus in French society, I would argue. And in Britain, by contrast, we find division in society about issues of security and liberty. We find a competition of ideas. Influential actors propagate radically different competing ideas about how exactly the state should balance the security of the collective with the civil liberties of individuals. And there's a vigorous debate on these issues in the British media, and civil liberty NGOs and other liberal voices have been able to make an impact on government policy, have been able to make the government change course on some occasions. There has been this division, there has been this competition of ideas which has had an impact on policy. And when the idea of security gets challenged, there are many cases in France where you do have a popular jury. Excuse me, so this is a derogation. So they have these special anti-terrorism courts which do not have a jury of ordinary members of the public. In Britain, by contrast, Britain uses ordinary courts with juries. So even terrorist suspects are judged by ordinary members of the public. And that introduces an element of uncertainty into British terrorism trials, which is not in the French context. And so it's a sort of restriction or a constraint that the government needs to take into account. If we think about terrorism crimes or offences, France has a very broad terrorist offence which it has used on hundreds of occasions, the so-called association of wrongdoers offence. So it's an offence to be part of an association of wrongdoers which is formed with a view to carrying out a terrorist act. But to be guilty of that, the court doesn't, or the prosecutor doesn't have to show that the individual involved intended to support an act of terrorism. So, for example, if an individual gives his passport to engage in passport fraud, which can be used to terrorists sometimes, but can also be used for other criminal activities, maybe he doesn't know exactly what his passport is going to be used for. But it turns out to be used in relation to a terrorist enterprise. That person can be convicted of association of wrongdoers in relation to terrorism. French judges, confirmed that to me. So that law allows the French authorities to cast the net quite widely and to imprison a wide range of suspects. If we look at Britain, generally British terrorism offences are more precise than those of the French, and they're not as wide-ranging. They have a conspiracy offence, conspiracy to cause explosions, which generally requires a high level of evidence. You have to show that all the individuals involved in the conspiracy intended to support a conspiracy that will cause explosions. They also have a new offence since 2006 of the preparation of terrorist acts, which similarly you have to show an intention to support a terrorist act. So generally, British terrorism offences are not as wide-ranging as the French. We could also look at the issue of deportations. Deporting terrorist suspects or suspected extremists to countries where they may be tortured, to Tunisia, to Egypt, to countries in North Africa and the Middle East where they might be tortured, because if you go to some of these countries and you're a suspected jihadist, there's a real risk that you will be tortured because you run up against the ideology of a government like the one in Egypt. But nevertheless, that didn't stop France deporting lots of suspected extremists to these countries since the 1990s, well, certainly since the year 2000 and 2001. So in the 10 years after 9/11, for example, France deported 129 suspected jihadist or extremists. French judges generally didn't stop the government deporting suspects to countries like Tunisia and Egypt, even though there was a risk they would be tortured there. So 129 deportations in 10 years. During the same period, Britain only deported 9 suspects to countries, 9 suspected extremists in relation to sort of jihadist ideology. They only deported 9 because they had great difficulty deporting them to places like Tunisia. They couldn't deport them to Tunisia, not to Egypt. They could deport them to Algeria eventually, after getting assurances from the Algerian authorities that eventually satisfied English judges. But generally, English judges have been very reluctant to let the British government deport these people to countries where they might be tortured. And so they've stopped that a lot. Interestingly, I mean, my understanding is that in Spain, the Spanish government and Spanish judges are a bit closer to the French on this than they are to the British. That Spain has deported many people to Morocco and other countries, even though there's a risk that they could be tortured in those countries. So overall, I argue that the French legal regime for dealing with terrorists is more draconian, or suspected terrorists, is more draconian than the British one. And my argument is that the consensus around security in France has enabled the authorities to make that draconian response, a consensus that extends across elite society and includes judges to a large extent. Now, if we turn to the second area of practice, the second area of the response to terrorism that I mentioned, we'll look at counter-terrorist operations. And here we find that, again, there have been many significant differences between the two countries. Now, in France, the consensus around the idea of security, the preeminence of security as a concern for France, that has had an important effect on operations. I interviewed many French police and intelligence officers, and they told me that, or they didn't tell me explicitly, but from analysing those interviews, the strong sense that one gets is that French police and intelligence officers do not feel themselves to be under any great degree of public scrutiny. They don't feel themselves to be under pressure from critical voices in the media when it comes to any potential violation of civil liberties. They tend to operate in a permissive environment, an environment which gives them quite a wide range of freedom of action to do what they want in relation to counter-terrorist operations. And that was especially clear in the 1990s when the sort of contemporary jihadist threat to France first emerged. Back then it was people linked to an Algerian jihadist group called the GIA, the Groupe Islamique Armée. And when that threat first emerged in France, and when France was attacked by individuals inspired by this group in the mid-1990s, France did mass arrests, arresting as many as 60, 80, 100 people in one operation. So massive and sometimes indiscriminate counter-terrorist operations at that time. And French police officers told me that during certain periods, it was explicit police policy to arrest the maximum number of people possible and to sort of see what that brought in terms of information. So to do fishing expeditions, as one officer described it. You just go there and maybe there's a large group of people, you don't know who they all are, but you arrest all of them to find out what information you can get out of some of them. Maybe you release a lot of them a day or two later, but you arrest them nonetheless. Now this reduced as the years went on because France developed its intelligence capability so that it could be a bit more targeted. But the point here, though, is that French society permitted France to do those massive operations, those mass arrests, when the government and when the authorities felt it was necessary, from an operational point of view. Now, if we move beyond actual terrorists or suspected terrorists to those who, let's say, sympathise with terrorism or maybe support terrorism, We also find that the French have taken a consistent zero-tolerance approach to radical Muslim clerics and others they suspect of radicalizing young people with militant ideas. So they've taken strong action against radicalizers, recruiters. They've also taken strong action against people who maybe expressed strong criticism of the West without necessarily calling for violence. There are some cases of that which are documented in my book. And the French government launched what it called the fight against radical Islam. So not just the fight against terrorism, but the fight against radical Islam as such. They have an interesting instrument called the regional polls for the fight against radical Islam. And the question becomes there is, who defines what is radical and what is not? These people are not necessarily supporting violence, they're not necessarily calling for violence, but they're engaged in radical Islam, and therefore they're of interest to the authorities and they're of interest to French intelligence. But the question there is, as I said, who defines radical Islam? And some of the measures they might take against people suspected of being involved in radical Islam is they might shut down a bookshop, they might shut down a commercial enterprise, they could do administrative checks, these kinds of things to disrupt what they would believe as to be networks of people engaged in or involved in radical Islam. But not necessarily a whole lot of evidence of links to violence. Now, there's a different climate in the UK. As I said, there's more contestation around security, liberty and related ideas. There's a vigorous public debate on these issues, and the British media have devoted considerable space to reporting on and criticising counter-terrorism law and operations. So I mentioned how French police officers don't feel themselves under any great public scrutiny, under any particular media scrutiny. But British police officers I spoke to, so the French don't feel under scrutiny, but the British police officers that I spoke to, by contrast, said that they feel themselves to be under considerable public scrutiny. And they said that if they carried out mass arrests like the French have, there would be a public outcry. So they feel themselves a bit more, under the public view. One police officer I told recalled a particular arrest operation where he felt that people in the media were sharpening their pencils if this arrest didn't turn out to be substantial. It was a high-profile arrest. The evidence wasn't clear against the individual before the arrest, as is often the case in terrorism. He felt that people in the media were sharpening their pencils. In the left-wing media in Britain, they were sharpening their pencils if he didn't get that arrest right. He got it right in the end. There was evidence against the individual, but he felt that pressure beforehand. And the pressure comes from sections of elite British society, on the liberal side and on the left-wing side. It doesn't come from the right-wing media in Britain, which also is very important, but it's not the media is split in Britain, but the more liberal side of the media is sufficient to put considerable pressure and scrutiny on the authorities and sometimes to constrain their actions. So the British police feel themselves, under public scrutiny. They said they cannot do large-scale operations, and in practice, when I looked into this, I found that British operations against suspected terrorists have tended to be more focused than the French. So if we look at individual operations, there's no large-scale arrests, like arresting 50 or 100 people at once. The most they have arrested in an individual operation like that has been about 25 people. They've arrested large numbers of people, all told, since 9/11, over 1,000 people. So they don't hold back, but they're more discriminate in their operations on the whole, in their individual operations. So they've made, a robust response to terrorism. They've made a strong response in many ways, but it has not been indiscriminate. That's my argument. if we consider people who are suspected of supporting terrorism or not necessarily being directly involved, but supporting radical ideas, supporting violence. For some years after 9/11, Britain left most of these people alone, even though some of them were calling for terrorist attacks against the UK. So one prominent example was a radical called Abu Hamza, who was radicalizing people into terrorism, into violence. But he was left alone for a couple of years after 9/11. And we'll come in a moment to understand a bit why exactly that was the case. But eventually the British did change their approach from about 2004, and certainly from 2005-06. And the London bombings in 2005 are relevant here, but they're not the only thing. There was a more general evolution for other reasons towards the British tightening up on extremists or people who support violence. So getting tougher on people who incite violence. In terms of understanding a case like Abu Hamza, one has to understand a couple of different things. The British, first of all, they misjudged him from an intelligence point of view. They thought he was just a guy who spoke a lot, but wasn't really involved in anything substantial. Whereas actually in the end, that turned out to be the wrong assessment. He was more significant, and he was involved in recruiting people for terrorism. That was a misjudgment. Also, they believed that if they were to arrest him, that there would be a revolt in the Muslim community around him in Finsbury Park. So this idea of respect for communities influenced them in that sense. Actually, that also turned out to be a wrong calculation. The Muslim community around the Muslim community in Finsbury Park turned out to be against Abu Hamza, although they were a bit afraid to signal their opposition. But when he was actually arrested, there was a move away from extremism in Finsbury Park Mosque and to a much more moderate place that it is today. So there was a misjudgment on two accounts there by the British authorities. So they got a bit tougher on extremists who were supporting violence, but still in Britain generally there's a distinction drawn between violent extremism and non-violent extremism. So if there is sort of an Islamist group that simply has some radical political or religious ideas, then generally the British government will leave that group alone as long as it doesn't call for violence. As I said, the French take a different approach. They would take measures against that radical group as part of their fight against radical Islam, even if they're not involved, in supporting violence. So that's some of the differences on the operational side. Let me turn thirdly now to a sort of broader issue, which is the sort of long-term effort to improve social cohesion. And to improve social cohesion from the point of view of integrating immigrant communities. Now, Britain's approach to this has been, for a long time, basically multiculturalism. And that's been a policy followed since the 1960s, whereby British governments recognised different immigrant groups. When immigrants to Britain wanted to organise their social centres or their other activities around a particular ethnic or religious group identity, the British recognised that, the British government recognised that, and it even subsidised it. So if you wanted to have an Irish community centre, you could get funding from the government to do that. If you wanted to have a Moroccan community centre, you could do that, or an Islamic centre, you could do that. And you would be recognised by government agencies and perhaps funded. So in this context, it's been natural for the police to deal with different communities, the British police to deal with different communities. Police forces in Britain generally have training for their staff on community relations, on understanding the different communities that they need to deal with, and they have liaison officers who do outreach work in minority communities. The British police have also had a dialogue with Muslim communities, specifically. The Metropolitan Police in London, for example, is involved in a forum for dialogue with Muslim representatives. It's called the Muslim Safety Forum in London. And the Muslim Safety Forum is basically a place where police and Muslim community representatives meet and they exchange information and they try to monitor hate crimes against Muslims in the UK. They try to monitor Islamophobic attacks on Muslims in Britain. So they try to monitor these hate crimes and to take action against it if possible. And that's the police's job, to try to take action against that. Now, in France, there's a different background in terms of the broader philosophy, the broader approach to integrating or not integrating immigrant communities. France has its Republican philosophy, which involves a strong emphasis or an emphasis on strong national identity, based around the idea of France and Republican France. So a strong national identity and a strict approach to integrating minorities. So in contrast to the British, the Republican model of integration in France has tended not to give official recognition to distinct immigrant communities. So they're less willing to subsidize groups to go off and create their own community centers based around a political or a particular ethnic or religious group identity. There is the French Council for the Muslim Faith, which is a broad political representative organization. So there has been some movement on that in terms of recognizing the French Council for the Muslim Faith, but that's a sort of a high-level thing. It doesn't really go down to the grassroots necessarily. And still, this Republican model of integration is very influential, and this reluctance to really place too much emphasis on different communities within France. And so then when it comes to thinking about the police in this context, not surprisingly, the French police do not believe that they should tailor their approach or their operations to assuage the concerns of a particular community. They don't believe that they should modify their operations to satisfy the concerns of a particular community. So, for example, one French police officer told me something about this, and I'll quote him. He said, quote, "I am aware of how the British police itself tries to discuss with the different communities. We have a different approach in France. We believe that it's for the community itself to play its Republican role. And it's not for the services of the state to come and remind people of the essential rules of community life in France, in any case," unquote. So the police is there. It's not particularly interested in having a dialogue with particular communities. They take a different approach. So quite different approaches in terms of integration philosophies, which does impact on how the police, interacts with the broader Muslim communities in the two countries. Now, some have criticised the British approach, including many British people, including even the British Prime Minister. Some of them have criticised the idea of multiculturalism. Some critics have said that Britain is weak and divided. It's got this division about how to respond to terrorism. It's divided. And its multicultural approach has only fostered the separation of Muslims and other groups, and in that sense it's only fostered extremism. And some of these critics have looked to France as an alternative. Excuse me. And some critics of the British approach have seen that they've said that France provides a strong national identity to its immigrant communities, including Muslims and all minorities, a strong national identity that could keep people away from extremism. That's been the argument of some experts like Robert Leiken, an American academic. So that's been the argument, but if we look at the trend in recent years, we see that actually radicalization and jihadist ideology has been growing quite strongly in France in recent years. That this strong identity doesn't necessarily provide a strong basis on which this strict approach to integrating minorities doesn't necessarily prove something that can reduce radicalization. So, increasing radicalization in France in many ways. At the same time, radicalization has also been growing in the UK. But still, the problem, I think, may be even worse in France than it is in Britain. And that's not just because of the attacks in Paris last month. There's a trend emerging in terms of French jihadism in recent years. A pattern of attacks carried out by French jihadists. And French jihadists have carried out 3 significant attacks in the last 3 years in Western Europe, which is a step up from previous trends, an increase in attacks compared to previously. So in 2012, you might remember that Mohamed Merah killed 3 off-duty French soldiers at various locations, and he also killed a rabbi and 3 children at a Jewish school. So that was a French jihadist using guns to carry out an attack in 2012. In May of last year, 2014, French citizen Mehdi Nemouche killed 4 people at a Jewish museum in Brussels. And then in January last month came the attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the Jewish supermarket in Paris. So you've got this, increasing pattern of attacks. You have had an attack in Britain in 2013, the Woolwich attack, where the individual used a knife to kill, or the individuals used a knife to kill a British soldier. But you seem to have a greater trend in France in many ways. And so there are a lot of questions now for the French model in light of the recent trend and in light of the attacks in Paris last month. The first question is, is the strict Republican approach to integrating minorities working? Is it working more generally? How does it affect radicalization? That's the first question. There's also a question about the fairly tough laws and operations against terrorism that France has mounted. I mean, this tough approach to counterterrorism, has, enabled France to successfully disrupt terrorist networks on many occasions. Some terrorists even moved to other countries, got out of France because they couldn't take the pressure. So it has disrupted networks in the short term. But the question is, will it prove counterproductive in the long term? We know that some sections of French society in the banlieue and elsewhere have experienced tensions in recent months, especially since the attacks. There's quite a lot of alienation in these sections of French society, and the question is, do tough police tactics contribute to that alienation? And ultimately, do they contribute to the increasing problem of jihadist radicalization in France? So is this tough operational approach proving counterproductive? That's the sort of second question. That's the second question facing France. They're the sort of key questions facing French counterterrorism today. Now, finally, let me try and say a few words about Spain, which I don't really know a lot about. But nevertheless, I'd like to try and say something about Spain in terms of the different dimensions that I've highlighted as important in my talk. So first of all, if we think about Spanish society, is there a consensus around security and liberty? Is there a consensus around the idea of security, or is there a competition of ideas? That's a question you might ask yourself. My take as a sort of non-expert would be that there certainly has been a fierce political division about a specific issue, which is whether or not to negotiate with ETA. And that, has been important. But one shouldn't take that division as representative of the broader field of, or broader attitudes to counterterrorism in Spain necessarily. It seems to me that there's always been a consensus in Spain that society must make a very strict police and legal response to terrorism. So my impression, but I'm open to correction on this by people who know better, but my impression is that when it comes to questions of security and liberty, there's quite a large degree of consensus in Spanish society, a bit like in France. So then if we then turn to responses to terrorism, I've noted already that Spain has little problem deporting suspected extremists to countries where they might be tortured. So that's a little bit like France again in some ways. If we think of other legislation, the Spanish approach does include some quite strict legislation. For example, in Spanish law, a terrorist suspect can be held for up to 13 days in incommunicado detention after he's arrested. So that's 13 days detention, up to 13 days detention, if extensions are granted, without proper access to a lawyer. That's often commented on internationally as quite a strict measure to have in your legal system. But again, maybe that's not representative of the broader Spanish legislative response. But there is some strict legislation here which has been developed over many years, first in relation to fighting ETA, and which is now being applied, or has been being applied, to jihadists. If we think about the Spanish police and Muslim communities, it's not something I really know much about. All I can say is that the Spanish police tend to have quite a tough reputation in general, so it's perhaps difficult to imagine them engaging in a lot of dialogue with Muslim communities or doing it on a systematic basis, but I'm not the expert on this, so again, I'm open to correction on this. I look forward to being informed by people who know more about this than I do. But that's the question. That's an interesting question to think about. How do Spanish police interact with Muslim communities? Where are they drawing the balance in terms of the sort of different models that are represented by Britain and France? And coming back to Britain and France, I would conclude by saying that neither country offers the perfect model to an effective fight against terrorism. Both countries have their problems, and radicalization has been growing in both countries. So neither has found really a sort of entirely satisfactory solution to the problem of terrorism. But arguably it's France that faces the greater questions today about its anti-terrorism policies. And I would argue that, not just comparing with Britain, I would argue that of all European countries, France has made perhaps the toughest response to terrorism in Europe. Nevertheless, it has still faced a pattern of attacks by French jihadists in recent years. So the lesson seems to be that a tough response to terrorism doesn't really reduce the problem. And one needs to have a broader response, if possible. One needs to have a proportionate response. That perhaps is the lesson of the French case that Spain and all European countries should keep in mind as they formulate their own responses to terrorism going forward. So I leave it there, and I look forward to your questions and comments.